let's talk about who was to blame for the Cold War.
The capitalist USA had been suspicious of the communist USSR since the Russian Revolution, and the feeling grew during the Great Depression. Likewise, the Soviet Union viewed capitalist USA like fascist Nazi Germany. Although they allied during the Second World War, the relationship couldn't last.
So what happened when the Second World War ended?
The leaders of Britain, the USA, and the USSR met in Yalta in February 1945. They agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 demilitarized zones to be controlled by Britain, France, the USA, and the USSR. Berlin would also be divided this way. The USSR would join the war against Japan, free and fair elections would be held in Eastern Europe, and a United Nations would replace the League of Nations. Exactly what would happen in Eastern Europe was kept vague.
So why did things change? I know that by the Potsdam Conference in July to August 1945, Truman had become US President and he was very anti-communist. And in Britain, Clement Attlee became Prime Minister.
That's right. Soviet armies now occupied large parts of Eastern Europe and had set up a communist government in Poland. Stalin wanted to punish Germany, but Truman thought that would be a mistake. Truman told Stalin that the US had a powerful new weapon, but he didn't give details, which made Stalin suspicious. In this atmosphere, little was achieved other than to agree that 6 million Germans would be resettled, and whoever controlled a zone of Germany could take what they wanted from it. There were no more meetings between the US and the USSR, as their suspicions were too great.
By 1947, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia and Albania were all under communist control. So Europe was divided between East and West.
Yes, an Iron Curtain was said to have been drawn across Europe. Capitalist versus communist.
So how did the US become more involved in this conflict?
Traditionally, Britain had an influence on affairs in the Eastern Mediterranean and had troops fighting against a communist takeover in Greece. But by 1947, Britain couldn't pay for this anymore and threatened to withdraw. Of course, this would leave the way open for the USSR to take over, so Truman agreed to pay for British troops to carry on fighting. He then promised money and equipment to any country threatened by communism.
Oh yes, that was known as the Truman Doctrine. So what was the USA's next step?
Truman's Secretary of State, General Marshall, felt Europe needed economic aid to get back on its feet, to stop communism taking hold, and also to trade with the US. Congress was reluctant, but after anti-Soviet leaders in Czechoslovakia were purged in 1948, they agreed to the Marshall Plan and approximately $17 billion of aid. It was very successful in stimulating capitalist economies, something Stalin recognized with suspicion.
What was happening in Germany?
In 1948, Britain, France, and the US combined their zones to form West Germany, which soon began to recover. Stalin couldn't do much about it, but he could do something about Berlin, the western half of which was connected by road, rail, and canal to the rest of West Germany. He cut these links, hoping to force West Berlin into communism. Instead, the Allies supplied West Berlin by air, so Stalin gave in and reopened the links in May 1949.
The Western powers also set up NATO, didn't they?
Yes, to promise to help each other if faced with any more communist threats.
So do you think the USSR was to blame for the Cold War?
Partly. Stalin was deeply suspicious of capitalism and the West, and was determined to control Eastern Europe. He went back on promises to have free and fair elections in Eastern Europe, and cut off supplies to Berlin, whilst being diplomatically hostile to the West by keeping a large army in Eastern Europe.
Could the US be blamed?
Well, Churchill and Roosevelt had been deliberately vague when discussing spheres of influence. Truman was suspicious of communism and kept details of the atom bomb secret. By setting up the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO, he acted in a way that Stalin thought aggressive.
So it's reasonable to blame mutual suspicion and lack of communication on both sides.
Certainly.
We hope you have enjoyed using Revise on the Move and wish you the best of luck in your exams.